All right, once more we're going to begin the second session. And this session is called Voices from the Community. And we have, I think, a very diverse group of people here to talk about the issues of immigration. There is Denise Ducheny, attorney and former state senator, and now senior policy analyst at the Transborder Institute. We also have Rhonda, no we don't. We also have Enrique Moreno, who I think is very well known in the community, the founder of Border Angels. We have the Consul General of Mexico in San Diego, Licenciada Remedios Gomez Arnau, and Ms. Luana Hallstrom, Principal of Collaborative Communications. She's worked for over 25 years in immigration issues, and I think she'll say a bit more about her work. So, welcome. Can you hear me? Yeah. In this session, I think we'd just like to open up the discussion. We had an introduction about sort of the issues. I think we've all had time to talk, especially during the break, our little enforced break, about how these issues affect our work and what we're thinking about, and some of the questions that came up. So would one of you like to start the discussion, have any comments or?
Maybe.
What?
Maybe I would like to start to do that.
Right.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate for organizing this panel. I think it's very important that we address the issue of language. And with the idea of going from rhetoric to dialogue. Because as Monica has already left, but as she said, yeah, languages can promote hate, but also can prevent, are you hearing me?
It's off and on.
Okay. Words, language can also prevent the solution of problems. We know very well, for example, when we go to counseling, marriage counseling, the first thing they tell you is don't call names, don't put adjectives, because that prevents of going to any settlement of problems. Try to be very objective and not calling names or adjectives. So I think that's very good, and also that the media is here because the language is mainly spread out by the media. Now we also have the social networks, but the media is very important. The electronic media above all, yeah, because more people are watching and hearing them. So the language they use has an impact in the people. I'm glad that you're starting to talk of going from illegals to undocumented. In Mexico, we've been using the term undocumented workers for 40, 50 years. Maybe when all this problem of the people coming with the proper documents started after the 22 years of the Rhetoric program, that started when the US government asked the Mexican government to help with supply of workers mainly to the agricultural fields and in the railroads work, because many of the male workers went to fight in the Second World War. So the Rhetoric program started in 1942. There was a binational program, lasted for 22 years. And when it was over in 1964, because they said these workers are not needed anymore, what had happened during those 22 years is that social networks had already worked and had already built. And the people knew of places, where their labor force was demanded, mainly in California, Texas, Illinois. So that's why in those states is where we started having more migrants. So since the 60s, we began seeing this phenomenon of people coming with the proper documents. Why was that? Well, the main division, I would say, and it's very difficult to generalize, and that's what we're trying not to do, because that's what creates the confusion in such a complex issue. But many people in United States were focused mainly, when the problem began to be visible, in the legal side of it. And in Mexico, they were most focused on the economic side of it. So it's difficult to have a dialogue when you are in a side only legalistic, and then you are on a side only economic. This is an economic phenomenon that is not fit in the legal framework. And if you are only looking at the violation of a legal framework but not the economic issue, well, you won't be able to get the dialogue that we are trying to promote. So that's very good. Now, usually the reality evolves more quickly than when the people start thinking of changing maybe their habits or the way they address or they talk about things. Now we are discussing of the better fit term of undocumented workers, when now it's not only workers, but it's also the component of family members, because as an unintended consequence of some changes in enforcement, the circularity of the phenomenon that had been predominant since the 60s to the 90s began to change. And as the workers that used to come work and go back to Mexico, in the case of Mexico, they couldn't do that anymore. So, and you cannot be without your family members a long time. I mean, you miss your wife, you miss your spouses, you miss your children. So the family began coming here. Then it got complicated and enlarged and became more permanent. So the things go changing, and now maybe only workers would not look into the whole phenomenon. And there are experts that are starting talking about the unauthorized. Why? Because half of the people that are here without proper documents enter first with their visa, and they overstay or they began working with a tourist visa. That is not allowed. So, but anyway, it's very positive that we start talking about which is the best language that would we should be using to address this phenomenon. And maybe I would leave it like that, and I would add more comments to allow the other panelists to talk about this.
Let me, because a lot of what my notes really bounce off of the previous panel to some degree, and I think it's, I bring a slightly different perspective, both as an attorney and what she said, I cued on the same thing, words do matter, but think about them in some other contexts. And for me, what Mr. Vargas said at the beginning about, well, wait a minute, I never thought of myself as illegal, it cued me to a lot of things. And as an attorney, I had the same problem he does. I looked at it very legalistically. I started practicing immigration law pretty much when I came out of law school in I shouldn't say this, everybody will know how old I am, 1979. And I was trying to remember, the question I didn't ask that maybe Peter or some of the others, journalists here may be able to remember this, or we should find a project for a student on this. But what was the language we used in the 80s when we were fighting Simpson Mazzoli? Because you're right, what happens is it comes up in the context of the discussion of the immigration reform is when you suddenly have all of this huge spin going up. But my recollection is in the 80s we had a lot of this same debate because we were moving toward comprehensive immigration reform. And so you had the Simpson-Mazzoli debates in the early 80s. Mm-hmm. Then you had the 86, you had the actual Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is what it was called, not amnesty, which is how it's commonly known. And then you had sort of a whole sort of, then it went around for a little while. Then we hit a recession in the early 90s. Then suddenly everybody's becoming citizens, and suddenly you get to 94, and you get the backlash thing, that if you read Peter's book, I do recommend this, it's out in the hallway, you can get one after this is over. But you see that same thing happening, like you said, with the Germans, with the Italians, with the Irish. I mean, this country's history reflects that. And at every stage, you have different kinds of language being used to sort of isolate, alienate, downgrade in a variety of ways these immigrants, and mostly out of fear. And the fear that Benjamin Franklin expressed about the Germans, the fear that others had about Italians, oh my gosh, we're all going to become Catholics, right? Or, the influence of the church when you had Southern Europeans coming in, the influence of Jews when they started coming in even in the late 1900s, the ones that moved to New York and before the Hitler refugee issue. You had, every time, there's always been some kind of language, there's been some sort of push, there's been some sort of law. And so if you look at it, if you grew up studying immigration law the way I did, you get a much more nuanced view, and you get much more frustrated by the language. And so, folks are immigrants, they are non-immigrants, they are asylees, they are excluded, they are entered. There's a whole huge variety of visas. And some of what Remedios said, you have to sort of look at that history of immigration law to understand. Nobody was illegal before 1888, and then only Chinese, right? Then you go all the way to the 20s before you start trying to figure out how to limit the number of Italians and Slavs and Poles who were coming. With the first real, nobody was illegal before the 20s. Who said that in the earlier one about the 20s? The language went back to the 20s. Well, the reason it only goes back to the 20s is because nobody was illegal before the 20s. And then you had phenomenon like the Bracero program. And when it ended, the legal rationale for what happened that she described is that we changed the quota system. And so you moved from a Bracero program that was flowing back and forth, had its own issues, but nonetheless, you moved in the 60s to a hemisphere quota. And then the hemisphere quota, once upon a time, Mexicans basically used up a lot of the Western hemisphere quota. And the hemisphere quota was based on, trying to exclude people, again, had to do with Western Europe and some of that. But you have a quota that was hemisphere-wide. So if Argentina didn't use the visas, Mexico could. Then in the 70s, when people got a little bit in a recession and anti-immigrant again, it was every country should be the same. So if you're Jamaica, if you're South Africa, if you're Mexico, you get the same number of immigrants every year. How does that relate when you have a system that's designed around family unification and workforce needs? Well, the family unification piece of that lends itself toward Mexicans, Filipinos, folks who have large families here. And then you get into these historical periods of refugees. So then you have the Vietnamese, and you have the boat people, right? The Cubans, and they're refugees, and they're not legal until they're legal. But what are they in between? So so you get this sort of nuanced view of these things, and you have problems with language like amnesty and illegal, which creates this criminality picture. And the problem and I'll switch my other hat, from a public policy maker point of view, when you start criminalizing something that isn't really criminal in the legal sense of the word, it is a civil, immigration is a civil action. It is not a criminal action. Now, those laws did change. Somebody asked that earlier. My recollection, somebody can correct me, but my recollection is that the change was not after 2001. It was actually in about 96, 97. And it was part of the whole, we did immigration reform and still people came, right? And the backlash, in part, if you think about it, had a lot to do, by 94, when 187 was on the ballot in this state, what you had was, is a reaction to people becoming legal immigrants. Because you had a reaction to the fact that people had become legalized and were becoming citizens, and now we're able to vote. And so you sort of had, the timing is real off. It had to do with the recession in the early 90s. But then you get the problems of the licenses. The driver's licenses, nobody had an issue with people having a driver's license just so they could drive in the state until 1994. That didn't happen until 1994. I mean, I did immigration cases under the I did them before that, but I did them under the Immigration Reform and Control Act for people who had Social Security cards and driver's licenses that I could trace back to 1962. And people, that was not the issue. And that became an issue only as recently as 94. And part of it was this response to the things that are historically in this book were similar for other immigrant groups is, whoa, wait a minute, there's too many of them. And that is a very different phenomenon. And you start using this language that has people without driver's licenses, makes them illegal in other ways. And you had in 94, also 95, the Gingrich Congress, which then did the welfare reform, which included a lot of immigration, withholding benefits from immigrants, including what became the biggest fight here, legal immigrants, lawful permanent residents. But when you started trying to implement their benefit exclusion issues with who could get SSI, who could get food stamps, who could get all of these different programs we have, I remember going through debates, and you have, again, you go back to all of these different statuses. There's a great status that we used to use, and I used to have to get up and have this discussion all the time because it had to be in the regulations, called PRUCALs. PRUCALs are people living here under color of law. Don't really have status, not really a lawful permanent resident, kind of has a piece of paper says, we won't send you home until we figure out what to do with you. And you've been allowed to enter, kind of, sort of, you can't really work. You may not have work authorization. But they're a creature of immigration law. They're not illegal. But people will treat them that way under certain laws and benefits. So it really does matter as we move to the public dialogue, how you think about it, and what people hear from their constituents and what they read in the newspapers has a lot to do with how folks view this, because people are so simplistic in their view, and this goes to the journalists, people are too simplistic in their view of immigration, and so then they just say, well, there's illegal and there's legal, and everybody can become legal, all they got to do is apply and stand in line. But they miss the whole part about the illogic of the current quota system, the fact that people have these very huge blended families, like the one that Mr. Vargas described, but that's true throughout the country, in a variety of family settings. And then you have people then trying to write laws around these things that don't understand them and whose constituents are fired up sort of just based on this sort of emotional reaction. And so, the argument, alien, obviously, I mean, E.T. sort of solved that one. I think why that went away was after E.T. But you've seen people go through this, and it seems to me we went through a lot of this undocumented. I had thought this illegal, and I was surprised when I heard from this panel that AP was using illegal again, because I thought we had this debate in the 80s and 90s to a large degree. And it's sort of like we sort of started out over again, and again, once the immigration reform bill, was out there, people started looking at that again. And I would argue, and pardon, just one close, just to throw out for discussion later too, it is a bit separate to talk about immigration, but workforce is a big piece of it. And at some point, and I was at a conference recently where a person who is part of the Opinion Yet, the transition team, talked about it in workforce terms. And said, and NAFTA changed that dialogue, should have, even more than it did, in terms of the North American continent and thinking about a workforce. And how do you deal with the workforce issues? I mean, and remember, the European Union, before it was so united as it is now, had a lot of issues with guest workers, right? And people staying, and do you get to become a citizen just because you were born here? A lot of the same issues we hear here were heard in Europe until they became a united economic center and people could move back and forth freely across the borders. If you're going to talk about this in economic terms, you really do have to think in workforce. And the flip side, but it's not enough, I think it's true, I'm listening to that, to say undocumented workers, because so many folks are young people, families, who are here in different ways and different times and spaces. And you have, there was a whole issue some years, during that same period of senior citizens and bringing your mother in. Well, they're not going to work here, and maybe they're disabled and they maybe need health care, but you bring in your family, and my one last sort of little story, but the coming out that Mr. Vargas referred to at the beginning reminded me of one of my favorite case stories. Was a gentleman who came into, I had 2 or 3 of these, but people who came to, whose cases I handled under the Immigration Reform and Control Act to acquire work authorization, which is really all they're requiring, by the way, not just legal, but it's work authorization is really what the game was about. But they had been living here, basically closeted. One of them was to appearance would look to you like a Caribbean, African-American, but he was from Acapulco, and he'd come here when he was 12, and he'd been passing for African-American, which was entertaining for those of us who were old enough to remember when being black wasn't such a cool thing. But he'd been passing as black in San Diego for many years, and then was almost afraid to come forward to, he came to me like the last day he was out, that you could file, because he'd been afraid to come forward because he could lose his sort of cover if everybody found out he was a Mexican. And the other one that was sort of one of my favorites, but his name was Mr. White, and he was from Panama, and he, you know, it's like, how do you think about these folks who are real live people with these stories? And during that period, I immigrated some of the best chefs in this county. Some of the folks who had been working here for 20 and 30 years, doing incredible work, but with no sort of authorization. So unauthorized is an interesting point. Work authorization maybe should be different than immigration. And you know, what's illegal are drugs that are smuggled, not people. And we really do have to figure out ways to talk about this. If you're going to get a dialogue in the legislature, and I think Luana's the best one to talk to some of this, but you got to get it to dialogue and to get members who are stirred up by all these emotional issues to actually talk about these issues. You got to get them away from the notion that a person can be a crime. Being a person is never a crime. You commit a crime if you kill somebody, if you rob somebody. But to stereotype folks into that basket makes it real easy to dismiss them and say, I don't have to give any benefits to felons. I don't have to worry about them having families. I don't have to think about those issues if I can basket them.
One of the things that seems very interesting here is that the way that language, because we are talking about language, can't really capture all of this very, very complex reality of immigration. And yet, because we begin to simplify, because perhaps it's very hard to talk about all this using so many different terms. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the kind of damage, the kind of consequence that has by simplifying it. I think I'm just very, very briefly here. Again, I'm the moderator, I don't want to talk much. I work in Mexico. That means I'm in Colegio de la Frontera Norte. And I do, because of where I come from, my position is that it's a workforce, it's an economic issue. Mm-hmm. And so we always talk about trabajadores indocumentados, you know, migración indocumentada, but it's work related, it's economic. And I think that that's one thing that we have to consider on both sides of the border.
I really appreciate being here. I have worked on this issue for many years, over 25 years. I think I'm coming on 30, and quite by accident. And because this is an issue where we are trying to get ourselves to a point of true dialogue, my comments are very pointed, so please be patient with me. I really want to work from my thoughts here to help to try and communicate how maybe we should be framing this discussion and the impacts of not doing so correctly. So I'm here to share a perspective on the language of immigration from the employer's perspective. Specifically, my background is agriculture, but as I've been working on this issue, I have come to understand this issue also on a broader context. However, regardless of the industry, when we speak of immigration, we're referring to the unique role immigrants play within our borders and how we view not only the immigrant, but also the impact that they bear on society, community, economy, lawfulness, and it goes on. We get caught up in the rhetoric, and then we forget that immigrants are people just like us. Most often, they're caught up in dysfunctional systems. It is the system, the immigration policy, that is at the root of most of this rhetoric. And unless we can move beyond that, we're going to continue in what I call a toilet bowl syndrome. That's exactly what we're dealing with. Only when we can talk openly about what immigration policy is today, and then open a new page about meeting the realities of today, can we begin to solve some of the serious challenges that we're facing. Agriculture does have a very unique place in this immigration policy discussion. While agriculture right now employs a very small number of this overwhelming unauthorized immigrant population, roughly 1.2 million of the 12 or 14 million that we have been able to identify. This number supplies the majority of the workforce within the agriculture industry. And specifically to California, California employs almost half of that 1.2 million. California produces over 50% of all the fresh fruits and vegetables that we consume in this country. Less than 2% of the population actually feeds 100% of the world. That's staggering when you realize that at one time, everyone was involved in food production at some level. This critical population, this 1.2 million, is one that deserves very serious attention. And when we talk about how immigration policy works or does not work, we need to think about this particular population as an example of how important immigration policy is. And then you can take that and you can move beyond and you look at how immigration policy affects us in so many other ways. There's a lot of talk today about feeding 9 billion people by 2050. We talk about the technology, we talk about the land, we talk about water, we talk about all the important resources that are going to be needed to fulfill that obligation or that critical objective. But somehow we're missing the point. We're missing the importance of the people who make that happen. It is true, I will tell you, that if we don't have a workforce, then you really don't have to worry about the critical concerns of agriculture, like those identified in the California Agriculture Vision Strategies for Sustainability. This is a plan that we're working on in California for so that we hope that we have sustainable agriculture by 2030. Things like improving access to safe, healthy food for all Californians, securing an adequate water supply, assuring a strong labor force through fairness to agriculture workers and employers, effectively detecting, excluding, and controlling invasive species, expanding environmental stewardships on farms and ranches, assuring agriculture adaptation to climate change, promoting robust regional markets for producers, cultivating the next generation of farmers and ranchers, promoting agriculture research for the 21st century. We don't need to worry about that stuff because we won't have a labor force. Agriculture right now is seeking reform of federal immigration and workforce laws to ensure its stability, its future viability, and a secure and vibrant workforce. We need to do this in a way that does not seek to criminalize agriculture workers or employers. We need immigration policy that works to provide a better quality of life for immigrant workers, employers, and the communities that they serve. I've worked this issue for 25 years, as I told you. I've lived it personally. I've witnessed the fallout and the tragedies throughout the country. I've testified before Congress. I've worked with bipartisan legislative policy. I've worked to create national studies to point out the deficiencies in the current H-2A program. By the way, the only legal program to bring farm workers into this country. I've watched communities fall apart. I've watched farmers lose their farms. I've watched employees suffer. I've watched their families suffer. I continue to witness as changing administrations battle each other out on rhetoric instead of strategy and action. It's a bloodbath out there right now. We're not seeing anything. We say there's not a bill out there. We're not doing anything. It's a bloodbath out there right now. And the victims, there's no winners in this war, by the way. It is a war. There's no winners in this war. The victims are everybody. Americans need to be careful about what they ask for. They need to be informed. They need to understand. Immigration policy and or lack of it does not work in a silo. It has implications that connect to all of us. And as Americans, we understand the importance of living in a lawful nation. And we also know the importance of immigrants and the importance that they have played in building our country. So it stands to reason that we also need to understand that we need to have paths so that we can allow immigrants to be here lawfully. I was thinking of Jane Goodall the other day because there was an article about her and about her work in a local paper. And I thought it's really a shame that this woman has probably, and it's not a shame, the work that she's done is wonderful, but what's a shame is that she probably has had more success educating and creating understanding and people coming together and working for a species, more success than we have had dealing with the human race and dealing with immigrants that are part of all of us and affect our lives every day. And that is a tragedy.
Well, buenas tardes. I'm Enrique Moreno with Border Angels Ángeles de la Frontera, and I'm delighted to be back here at my alma mater speaking at this very important issue. It's an issue that I have a strong passion for. I just wrote an op-ed that hopefully will be published in the Union Tribune in the next couple of days that talks about a lot of the things that we've said here today. And let's remember that this month is the Stop the Bullying Month here in this country. And words hurt. Words can really hurt. And no human being is illegal. When somebody robs a bank or steals, they've committed a criminal act, but nobody calls them illegal. So why are we calling each other illegal? No human being is illegal. He's been referenced several times, and I just came back from New York where I lectured at John Jay College in New York and New Jersey City University in New Jersey. Just came back yesterday. And I talked about this topic, and when I was referencing some of the evil purposefully behind these words oftentimes, I referenced Benjamin Franklin, because he said, those people, they only want to speak their own language and hang out in their own neighborhoods and wave their own flags. And never in our lifetime have we heard there's too many Germans in this country. But there was a time. Too many Polish, too many Italians, too many Irish. So this has been going on for a long, long time. And by using these types of words, it lends itself not only to dehumanizing people, but also to spreading the myths about people. Myths that many of us have heard. Those people don't pay taxes, for example. Those people don't pay taxes. When was the last time any of us were at a store, and the person in front of us was speaking another language, and the clerk says, oh, I notice you're speaking Spanish. Are you documented or undocumented? Because if you're undocumented, you don't have to pay taxes on those products. Never. Those people are only here for the benefits. When was the last time you saw a Latino on a corner with a sign that says, we'll work for food? You don't. You go to the Home Depot and there's 50 of them, but they really are there to work. But by using this type of language, it lends itself to criminal activity and to making these people less than human. We've all heard it before with these myths, the two biggest myths. You know, those people, they should just get in line. But the truth is, there is no line. We don't have a statue that says, give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. We have a wall that's led to the death of more than 10,000 people. But this is a country of laws. Well, there's a lot of countries of laws in the world. But let's look at some of the laws of this country. Child labor was the law of the land. Your grandmothers, and in some cases your great-grandmothers, couldn't vote because women couldn't vote. And slavery was a law of the land. And remember the words that were being used. Our African brethren were not even a whole human being. Jews eat their children. Wetbacks. This terminology, which was a legal term, wetback. This is terminology that was being used to describe human beings, and this is absolutely outrageous. Anchor babies. You know, they're very hurtful people, and when you talk about bullying, don't ask the person doing the bullying if it's appropriate. Ask the recipient how they feel. That's the key. If you go to somebody, I just spoke at an elementary school last week, Keller Leadership Academy here in San Diego, and you don't ask the bully, do you think you're bullying? You ask the recipient, how do you feel when you're being hit by those words or those fists? And there was a young lady that I was hoping that could come and speak here today, but she wasn't able to make it. She's a woman that when she went to school, a small group of people at that school would call her, you Irish this and you Irish that. So one day she didn't show up to school. So her favorite teacher went to go see what had happened. She knew that these words were being used against her, and she asked the mom, how come she didn't go to school today? Oh, she left early this morning. And they go into her bedroom, and 15-year-old Phoebe Prince had committed suicide. This is happening every day. Hate words lead to hate actions. Marcelo Lucero was referenced. Let's have a beaner boot party. Find a Mexican and kick him to death. An Ecuadorian, Marcelo Lucero, was killed in Long Island, New York. We went there. We did a vigil for Marcelo Lucero. We did the vigil the day after we had been in a place called Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. Well, 3 good white kids had killed a Mexican named Luis Ramirez. This doesn't just happen. It starts with words. Vicente Rodriguez is here. Vicente Rodriguez and I and a couple of other people started this campaign to get rid of Lou Dobbs from CNN. Because what he was doing was he was causing people to act on these words. So it's not just freedom of speech. I, like Tom Paine, support freedom of speech. But not when that freedom of speech leads to hate actions and the killings, like what Lou Dobbs used to do. Now Lou Dobbs is in Fox, where he belongs. But he was on CNN. So people were believing, this is CNN, it must be true, the things that he is saying. So hate words definitely lead to hate actions. One of the followers of Lou Dobbs was a young lady who's a member of the Federation of American Immigration Reform, which is classified as a hate group by many organizations, including the ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center. This woman wanted to start her own hate group, Minutemen, as a member of FAIR. She comes to San Diego, trains with the San Diego Minutemen, goes to Arizona, racially profiles, finds a man walking into his house with 2 accomplices, her and 2 accomplices, and they kill Ramon Flores. Ramon Flores' wife, they attempt to kill her, she hits the phone. You can hear on the 911 call, what are you doing to my husband? 9-year-old Bricienda Flores comes out of the bedroom. They kill her too. Those things don't just happen randomly. They start off with hate words. And it's important that we clarify these words. Somebody mentioned amnesty. We're not looking for amnesty. That's another key word. Amnesty comes from the Greek word which means to forget. Like amnesia, comes from the same derivative. We're looking for a pathway to have humane immigration policies. That's what we're looking for. The myths, the 2 biggest myths of all. I mentioned the law one, but the other one is get in line. Those people should get in line. We would love to, but there is no line. There is no line. So by having these types of words, it makes it easier to dehumanize people, and it's important that we ask the recipient how they feel. Well, we can still ask them. We can't ask Phoebe Prince or Luis Ramirez or Marcelo Lucero because they're not with us anymore. When we talk about race in this country, we traditionally talk about black and white. Rarely when we talk about race do we talk about brown, because this country can't accept that it was wrong and what happened with slavery. They can accept that. But they cannot accept the fact, many people, that they invaded a sovereign land called Mexico. They took half the territory. They cannot accept that. They don't identify with that. So when they talk about race, they don't talk about Latinos in general. And it's important that we do accept it. I know many of you do accept it. We have our friends here from the Unitarian Universal Church, standing on the side of love. That's what we should be doing. We should be standing on the side of love And many of us are not, because like the great late Martin Luther King told us, if you stand there idly and you don't say anything about it, you're part of the problem. And too many of us don't use words. We just let it happen. We cannot continue to let that happen. So I think it's very important that we remember that each one of us can make a big difference, that the person that's going to make the change in this world is the person that we look at in the mirror every day. Because only love can overcome hate, and only light can overcome darkness. And the last comment, I know you all saw the debate a couple of nights ago. I was back in New York. Have you noticed that in the media, and I haven't seen the media write about this, but in the media, President Obama is referred to a lot more as Mr. Obama than President Obama. Is that a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that they talk about President Obama not being born here, or that he's Muslim? Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that he's black? And it was mentioned that President Obama mentioned undocumented worker in the debate, but it was not mentioned that Mitt Romney said illegals. Just like he said on Univision when he was talking to the two anchors there. He said, he carried it further. He said illegal aliens. Yeah. So it's important that we listen to these words, that we don't stay silent, because somebody's going to be on the receiving end of those comments that started off as a little trickle and then became a roaring thunder, became a tsunami, and that led to the decimation of millions of our Jewish brothers and sisters, to the mistreatment and continued mistreatment of our African American brothers and sisters, and people of color in general, to somebody that's gay or somebody that has a different religion. We're all of the same race, the human race, and it's important that we treat each other with that type of dignity and respect. And unfortunately, a lot of times, that comment, so what? They can take it. We should be on the receiving end of some of those comments and see if it's correct. And I assure you that they don't like it. They don't like it, and I know that we don't like it, so we need to speak out. We need to reach out to AP and tell them to change that book. I was aware of that because I've been meeting a lot with the Union Tribune, and they had mentioned that people should be able to have the choice, and let's call these people, they're not illegal. They're not illegal human beings. We can come up with some sort of a term, but it's important that we treat people with dignity and respect just the way that we want to be treated. This is a very important issue. The language of immigration from rhetoric to dialogue. Gracias.
I would, yes.
I think is really important, and it's something that I have not heard here today. But fear is a very strong driver, and fear paralyzes us. And fear has paralyzed this country from doing anything. And we really need to think about how to get beyond that.
Thank you.
The language.
I would like to open
Can
up.
I throw one little thing that we didn't mention, but just to throw it out there in the AP context? We had gotten something earlier today. Someone who invited me on the panel that couldn't be here, Andrea Guerrero, sent us an email the other day. And what she put out, and this is just for consumption of folks, but the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics has a resolution calling on them to not use the term illegal. And one of the ways they word it is interesting, because it talks about how you're innocent until proven guilty under the Constitution, so therefore, how can you be illegal until you've, how do you be illegal if you haven't been a criminal yet? And so I just thought I'd put that out there for just sort of the research piece of it, but the Society of Professional Journalists does have a code of ethics, and we ought to encourage AP and UT and everybody else to look at that.
Yeah, they and the Hispanic Association of Professional Journalists.
Of professional journalists, yeah.
Thank you very much. Why don't we open up the discussion to all of you as well? Questions, answers?